Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Linda Kromjong. I'm the moderator of this panel. I am, in real life, the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers. It's good to be with you here, and we are going to have an interactive session this morning. I have a great panel with me. I will not do long introductions who they are. Their bios are available on the website. But to my left, I've got Phil Bloomer from Business Human Rights Resource Center. Then here I've got Cornelia Gomez, and she works for the AsiaInspection. To my right, I've got Lene Wendland from the Office of High Commission Human Rights. And to the far right, I've got David Hammond from Human Rights at Sea. So it's a great panel. We could do interactive. So let me first share with you what is that we're going to do. We will have short interventions by the four panel members. After those short interventions, we will break out in round tables. We'll have 4 round tables, and you think, how can you have 4 round tables? I count 12. That is correct, but we'll have 4 groups. So that's group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. And in those 4 groups, you will focus on 4 questions that we want to have an interactive discussion, say, for around 30 minutes. After those round tables, we will come back, and the panel members, so each have been allocated a round table, will then feedback about what was the discussion, what were the trends, what were the insights, and then again focusing on what is their level of expertise on the topic of UK Modern Slavery Act. And then we will conclude with a Q&A, and we aim to really have finalize our session by 10:30 so that you have enough time for coffee and for networking. Why are we having this workshop here today, where we are discussing the UK Modern Slavery Act and where we stand? I assume that the majority in the room is aware of the UK Modern Slavery Act. Basically, it built on a momentum being created by the UN Guiding Principles, who were endorsed in 2011. And the UK Modern Slavery Act came into force in 2015. And it's all about tackling and eradicating forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking. And as part of the Act, there is an independent anti-slavery commissioner being appointed, Kevin Highland, who is doing a lot of research, a lot of investigations, is publishing reports, is linking up business, government, and civil society and NGOs. But one of the things that is also part of the UK Modern Slavery Act is the increased call for transparency and reporting, which we not only see here, but also in many, many other initiatives. So every company, above a certain size, is obliged, to fulfill those reporting requirements and to publish or to disclose a statement about what are the risks, what are the issues, but also how they are trying to address those. And we have seen those first statements coming live, because the obligation is that by the end of the financial year that ended March 2016, then the first statements needed to be made public. There's many reports already out there that analyze what's being published, that have a view about quality, that have a view about impact. But before we go into that one, which will be addressed also by the panel members, I really have a few very simple questions for you that I would like you to ask and to answer, just to set a bit the scene for this discussion. So if I could have on the screen the slide with the login code to the poll, here it is. So if you could log into www.slido.com and use the hashtag SSCEU, then the first question should pop up on your screen. And this is the first question. Has your company already published its disclosure statement? And it's a very simple yes or no. Yes, it's coming up now. But still, no, I think the conclusion is very clear here. There's a long way to go here. And that could be very simple also because of the way that your financial years have been structured. to some extent. And there was a period of grace, let's put it that way, still. So I don't think the ambition was to be 100% already right now. But I think 30/70, I think let's leave it here for now. That's a bit setting the scene. If we then go into the second question, can we pop that one on the screen and have it available for you? Has it helped you? Because I think that's the real question. Is it helping companies, to support driving the discussion and after that also addressing the issues that you have? Because it's nice that we have those reporting requirements, it's nice if we have the law, but it's meant to have an impact. So that is what this question is about. This one is more promising. Although there's still votes being there, but I think what we can see from the trend is, yes, it has helped drive the discussion. And this is also, I would say, consistent with what we see from review, from research being done, that one of the things that everyone acknowledges right now as a result, as a positive impact of the UK Modern Slavery Act, is that it has raised awareness, it has triggered a discussion. It's the first, say, reporting round now, which might be far from perfect. There are a few great examples, but there is many more that could improve. Whether it is really making an impact in driving change and addressing the issues and eliminating really the issues, that is still, I would say, probably too soon to tell from an impact perspective. So thank you for those insights, just setting the scene a bit and waking you up. I would now like to hand over to our panel members and start first with Cornelia to my left. As already said, working for AsiaInspection, and she's going to share with us, her perspective with regards to social compliance and auditing, and what is that she sees within, say, the bigger companies. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Linda. Good morning, everyone. So yes, I'm working with AsiaInspection, AI. So AI is historically a quality control company, but we've been carrying out, and we are now an audit body too, and we have been helping our clients for a long time now, worldwide, to carry out a risk analysis and secure the supply chain. So very practically, this means putting the risk analysis into practice on the ground with different kind of audits, of supplier audits. So this could be ethical audits, structural audits, environmental audits, or more focused assessments like health and safety, fire safety. And I'd say so what does it mean? It means that we are sending, in regards to the Modern Slavery Act, it means that we are sending auditors to Bangladesh, India, Colombia, Ethiopia, on vendor or client request, with an audit protocol, an audit methodology, either the client's one or more famous audit methodologies, like, for example, CDEX. And we're asking questions to factory management, to workers. We're checking documents and procedures to find out if there is any expression of what we call modern slavery today. So very practically, in reality, how are migrant workers treated? Is there bonded labor? Is there forced labor? Are they allowed to leave at a certain time? Are they allowed to leave their employment? Do they have to pay to be recruited, etc.? And I think we'll touch down on that point again, but this really all depends on how accurate and clear your supply chain is, or our client's supply chain is, because we could audit millions of factories if it's not where the production is. Obviously, it's a bit irrelevant. So yes, the second point, and we'll probably touch on that also during the roundtables, is what do you do once you've found actually expressions of what we call modern slavery, so ill treatment of migrant workers, child labor, bonded labor. So how do we, after identifying the risks, finding issues, how do we mitigate those risks? How do we go forward and try to convince managers on the ground in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, to change? So yeah.
Is that just one question? Is that the most difficult part, convincing the managers on the ground that it's an issue, that they need to do something? No, what is the critical issue?
I think the first point is I was going to conclude with that later, but I think the first point is what does our client want? Really, what does he want us to? Does he want us to find something? And this is a case for most of our clients, but it's really what is the intention behind the audit? What is the quality? I mean, of course, we send qualified and auditors, but what are the questions relevant? Because obviously we have to comply with the protocol, the methodology they provide us. And are we in the right factory, really, today to check this?
Okay. Great, thank you very much. Short and crisp and within time. I'm now going to David, to my far right, who will focus in his capacity as CEO of Human Rights at Sea about what is happening within the maritime sector. And that is, of course, a specific sector because they are not in one place. They travel on the seas but in between countries and territories with specific issues. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Am I on? Thank you very much. Good morning, David Hammond. I'm going to give you a civil society perspective, a non-commercial perspective, the moral angle. When I talk about human rights, most people's shutters come down. I have experience at sea, so I've been a seafarer as well as a barrister, and now I'm the CEO. So I look at it from a practitioner's perspective, but I also look at it from a commercial perspective as well. We're an independent charity, maritime human rights charity. We're the only charity at the moment in the maritime sector that's charitable objectives. One of its charitable objectives is the development of the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights in the maritime sector. And Linda's already used the word transparency. Transparency, clarity, and accountability are our core values in everything that we do. We're also going to focus on the Modern Slavery Act, but if I cut to the critical issue is effective remedy. Everything else we can talk about and we will do, but without effective remedy, we actually don't have any effect. It's the same as being in court. If you don't have good law and effective remedy from that law to be implemented, then the rest is just noise. So the issues I want to, in my 3-minute introduction, I want to leave with you, bullet points are maritime sector, global sector, 90% of the world's goods travel by sea, 2/3 of the world's surface is covered by water. The rare metals in your phones, tablets and computers come by sea. The clothes you wear and the constituent parts come by sea. But the maritime sector has not woken up to this issue. And Phil, who will speak later, actually highlighted this in our conference a couple of weeks ago. Global protectionism, and protectionism from the individual, from the group, and from the state. Protectionism is we want to be the leader, we want to be the hub, we want to be the lead auditors. That is the noise, and that sows confusion. CSR, in my experience, is not taken seriously. It's all about competitive advantage amongst the providers, and that is sowing confusion. So is it a race to the top between the various providers, or are we just creating more noise and walking away from the issue of effective remedy? And I will leave it there, Linda.
Thank you very much, David. Lene, coming from your perspective as working for the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights, what do you see happening globally related to UN Guiding Principles, and how does the UK Modern Slavery Act fit within that one?
Thank you, Linda, and good morning, everyone. I think start by saying this is an incredibly pressing and timely subject. Those who are experts in the field of modern-day slavery and trafficking estimates that there are more slaves in the world now than there ever were. We tend to think about slavery as something that sort of went out of fashion a couple of centuries ago, but that is really not the case. So I think it is incumbent on all of us to really treat it with the urgency that is the gravity of the issue requires. I want to talk a little bit, as Linda was indicated, about the UN Guiding Principles, and seeing we've now had a poll, I will now, as David reminded me, that in the old days you would just ask people to raise their hands. So let me just ask, how many of you are familiar with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights? Oh, good. Good. That's a good start. So I will assume a certain level of understanding. So you will know that the UN Guiding Principles have basically 3 pillars, we call them, and they address, first of all, the duties of state to protect against human rights abuse by business. So that's a fundamental tenet of international human rights law, is that states that have the duties, the states are signing the conventions, the treaties, the agreements. And in the context of business activity, the core duty that states have is to protect against business doing something wrong. And the guiding principles are very clear that that protection can come through what we call the smart mix of measures. So it's both regulation, as when that is required, but also policy incentives, or indeed a mix of the two. So you have regulatory or policy incentives that have some kind of maybe stick attached, but also provide policy incentives, carrots to change behavior. Then we have the second pillar, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, which is really the new innovation that came about with the guiding principles in 2011, that recognizes that companies in their own rights have a responsibility to respect human rights, and this responsibility follows where there is impact. So where a company has an impact on human rights, it has a responsibility to do something about that. So it's not about a sphere of influence. It's not a responsibility that is determined by where companies can resolve a problem. It's a responsibility that's determined by where do you have an impact, where do you negatively, adversely impact people's rights, and what is then you have to do about it. So it's not, the responsibility doesn't stop with the first tier or necessarily with the 10th tier. It doesn't mean that you can do something at the first tier or indeed at the 10th tier, but it means a responsibility to be able to look into, or not be able to, a responsibility to look into across your activities where your impacts are, and then see what you can do about it. In that sense, the UK Modern Slavery Act is a very perfect expression of the UN Guiding Principles. It's the state taking a responsibility to regulate, to identify an issue, to say, here is a pressing human rights issue involving business. We are now asking and expecting companies to publish a statement, to go look for where that impact might be, and tell us what they're doing about it. So it's not about saying it's to address and highlight a particular challenge, but it's not about just saying companies mustn't have slaves. That's sort of a more rude and crude version of the approach. It's about finding out what is happening out there in the supply chains and being able to demonstrate what is being done to manage that risk of slavery. In human guiding principles parlance, we talk about the know and show. Companies are expected to know where their impacts are, and they're going to be expected to demonstrate what they're doing about it. So in that sense, the UN, the Modern Day Slavery Act, is an expression of the UN Guiding Principles and is not something new. Since 2011, this has been the expectation of companies across different human rights issues. This is just an expression in a particular space and on a particular issue. And so the learning and the processes that are already ongoing in so many companies around how to identify and manage their human rights risk as part of the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles, this is just one element of that. I'll agree with David that in many contexts, when it comes to the guiding principles, access to remedy is a big challenge. And I'm hoping that in the roundtable discussions, we can come to find out or explore where that sits in, because, of course, with the Modern Day Slavery Act, there isn't an accountability mechanisms for the act of slavery itself. There might be some sanctions if you're not publishing a statement. But where does that leave the whole issue for who is responsible for the actual act of slavery and what can be done about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Lene. Coming back to the comment you made about it's a huge issue globally. If you go into, say, the website of the Anti-Slavery Commission, it says 45 million people worldwide living in modern slavery today. And the assessment of the potential victims of slavery in the UK is 13,000 people. So this is not small numbers. I now hand over to my left to Phil. And Phil, you will share with us some insights about, what is it that you see from research and for your collaboration coming from your expertise in the Resource Centre.
Thank you very much, Linda. I think the first thing to say is, it's common knowledge now that forced labour is in pretty much every supply chain, whether it's, and even in the UK, and the official estimate is around 13,000, but our own Prime Minister has put it at 45,000 potential slaves in the UK. Whether it's in car washes, whether it's in mattresses, in the UK, mattress production in Dewsbury in the UK, whether it's in some of the sweatshops in Leicester. That's the reality. And of course, internationally, it's in mica, the sparkle in cosmetics and the painting cars, through to the refugees in the Syrian refugees in Turkey producing our clothes, through to smartphones and our food. So it's in everywhere, and therefore there is a huge onus on us all to ensure that this slavery, which we thought was abolished 150 years ago, is actually finally eradicated. So, what works? Well, let's start with what does not work. Business as usual does not work, in the sense that using recruitment agencies that are charging inflated fees is the first way in which you can ensure that there is slavery in your supply chain, bonded labour essentially in your supply chain. And Linda, with the Institute for Human Rights and Business, with its Coca-Cola, Unilever, Nestle, have formed a group called No Recruitment Fees. The company pays, and that's one area that needs to be addressed. A second one, in terms of what does not work, is compliance through announced audits of the first tier of your production. As Cornelia has just said, you can be guaranteed that if you're announcing audits with 6 weeks in advance and you're going to the first tier, you will not find anything, even though there may be things. The subcontracting that goes on, the subcontracting and the subcontracting that we know goes on in too many of the supply chains, leads to all that level of abuse, and that's where the abuse is occurring. And it's just not now satisfactory, as Lena said, to say, well, we're going in with one eye open, one eye shut. One eye open to the profits and the opportunity and the wages that we're paying in the first tier, and one eye shut to what's happening to the rest. So then what does work? What works is, first of all, there's no magic bullet to this, but it is the case that there is bold leadership from a relatively small group of companies demonstrating voluntary innovation. We've heard first, I've explained what the Institute... oh, that's me 3 minutes, bloody hell. Okay, very quickly then. What works as well as that no recruitment fees basis is to move from announced first-tier audits to include alongside that, firstly, an identification of the salient risks through research in the supply chain. Secondly, developing an action plan around that ensures that you've got unannounced audits to the second and third tiers, that you've got clear communication going down the supply chain to tell your suppliers that you are not prepared to accept it, and then, crucially, collaboration, because each company on its own at the second and third tier has very little leverage because they are producing for pretty much everybody and anybody. But you share those same supply chains, so that if there is collaboration between the companies to ensure that there is concerted effort together, then that's when the power of companies really becomes able to exclude that forced labour, that child labour. That's what's happening in Turkey right now today. There are children at work for our clothes, and that's the opportunity that businesses have to be able to ensure that you can do that. The final thing I'd say is the other thing that works is things like the Modern Slavery Act and also Obama's initiatives such as the Trade Facilitation Trade Enforcement Act and the disclosure requirements, which are now essentially moving from voluntary initiative to say there should be mandatory transparency and disclosure, and there should be increasingly mandatory due diligence, at least in terms of modern slavery. Sorry for going on.
Thank you, Phil. Maybe just to amend also, to complement what Phil there said, collaboration is key. Leverage is a critical topic. It's not easy, but what we also need is a collaboration with the governments who need to put in place laws and enforce them. And just want to make this point here as well. Thank you, I think, panel, for sketching the scene and just in really, crisp indicating what are the topics at hand that we're talking here about, what are the issues, what is the direction that we should move in more. And I think now the floor is open more or less to you to start having the discussion in the round tables. On the screen, if everything goes all right, we will have 4 questions popping up. or 4 topics to discuss. And the idea is that you discuss those 4 topics in your roundtable. So these are the questions that we would ask you to focus on. Your moderators or your roundtable leaders will help you through those questions, but they will probably be coming from their own expertise, maybe focus a bit more on one than on the other, depending on who is moderating. So interactive session, the floor is yours, your input, your thoughts, your discussions, your concerns, your solutions are welcome to be addressed in a roundtable. If I start to my left, Phil, would you like to go first?
Thanks. So we focused on the final question, manage to identify the risks below the first tier of suppliers and to keep in line with regulation. I think we heard, first of all, the importance of moving beyond tier 1, the need to really demonstrate the action, and one of the key issues was making sure that there's a demonstration of commitment and that there's action taken if change doesn't happen with suppliers, that there's a need for mapping of the supply chain, and to be open and honest in terms of what's happening in the supply chain in order to avoid serious reputation risk. We heard also from the electronics industry, particularly about collaboration with civil society, but also particularly within the sector, about providing leadership in terms of the second and third tiers, finding the key ways in which bonded labour can be avoided, whether it's recruitment fees, whether it's providing a safe place for passports, contracts in the language in which people speak, the workers speak. Those issues were critical. We looked at the issue of culture as well, and the way in which different cultures can affect the tolerance, such as in Thailand, the tolerance of conditions of forced labour. We then said that there's a need for really certification of social audit agencies and ethical recruitment agencies. There needs to be a greater emphasis on traceability. The way in which we can deal with traceability is through collaboration between the different companies, because on your own, your opportunity for traceability is significantly reduced. And we talked also about, finally, the fact that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There is a lot of things out there, so companies that are on this journey now can learn from a lot of other companies that are already a little ahead of them. And one of the things that we thought was also the need for signalling of companies, particularly collectively, to make sure that the supply chain understands what is expected of them, but then also taking action where change doesn't happen. And finally, that there's still a need for a good place for all business to be able to share safely some of these experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, for that great summary. Cornelia, what is your take from the group, and what was your focus area?
So much interesting insight. We addressed actually all of the questions because we had a very rich panel in terms of backgrounds. So I'll go more in a bullet point approach with really strong takeaways. So the first thing is really a keyword is risk. There's no risk-free world, and I think that we have to accept that. Some things are going to remain opaque. There's no managing the risk on our own. But also, we cannot do more than our sphere of influence. We have to accept that. Risk, it's the first start to go deeper is a risk-based approach. So first, use everything that's out there in terms of macroeconomic figures, data. So there's a first level screening we can do that is efficient and useful. Then really focus on product, sector. Try to really anticipate the risk, and try really to merge business. Try and understand what are the business risks, what are the human risks, and where they join. Also, root cause analysis. So, why are these risks emerging? Why are they here? And once risk is identified and there's a more clear pathway, we've said it's a long-term journey, and then we have to accept some challenges. So first, how to prioritize, because we've identified many risks. We have limited resources, so how to prioritize our action. And also an interesting point about terminology. So once you've prioritized, when you want to act on the ground, when you want to remedy, how do you, when you're really on the ground, on the grassroots level, how do you define a slave? How do you define a child labor? And how do you, adapt to local culture to make sure that the change is sustainable? Then, risk, challenges, then we, hands-on, we go there, we put our hands in the mud, and what, key word that came out was the deep dive. So really go deep, go to the most granular level possible, but in a specific way. Be pragmatic about what you find. It's interestingly enough, technology was, we've evoked it, but it's, even though it's nice, it's interesting, especially in the first screening part, and to get information bottom up. It's not the solution, in fact, it's not the only solution. It's not the golden bullet. And last point is remedy. So there's really no remedy without leverage. That's what a lot of came up. You need to have leverage. You need to, you need to motivate actually the person on the ground to change. Also, it's important to have trust. So just to give a very example that was said is that if you ask for even conflict minerals or child labor, if you ask somebody on the ground to change, it's not fair to leave him 2 weeks later for another supplier who's not doing the right job. And I think this is it. So a lot of keywords, but very interesting.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. Also on this roundtable, many, I think, relevant topics were being addressed. And you mentioned once the word, there's no silver bullet. I think that is something that probably all of us, will agree to. But many smaller bullets might make the solution there. Lene.
Thank you. So we also had I think, a very rich discussion. Some of the points that, of course, came up earlier also came up in our discussion. In our group, there were most companies seem to be in quite early stages. There's a recognition that this is an evolutionary process, that this is something that takes time to get to grips with. There was a recognition that one can build on existing processes within the company, and several companies were saying that they are sort of going through their existing management systems to tackle this challenge. And of course, that is perfect, as long as one makes sure that existing processes can indeed covers the kinds of issues that we were concerned about for the purpose of the discussion. Questions about prioritization. How do you prioritize? We had some, and maybe the example we can hear more about how you work with your suppliers in training to do self-audits, and then based on what you get back, you then prioritize for further action. Was an interesting practice. The issue about collaboration and training obviously came across as one of the most important aspects in trying to deal with the issue. You collaborate, you train, you work with the suppliers. It's not a policing type of situation that generates the change that is needed. It is working, building up confidence, building relationships with the suppliers, collaborating also across businesses, but very much tackling this in a collaborative spirit with the suppliers. We had a discussion about communication or language that you use around internally in the company, about how you sell this to senior managers, how you label this. And I think there was an agreement that human rights is not always the most helpful label to put on issues. But you can describe situations, you can use sometimes pictures. We're saying you're telling the story about what it is the company should be concerned about and why, and getting that story across can have a greater impact than what exact label you're putting on it. There was also recognition that regulatory developments like the Modern Slavery Act can drive change internally, because it can focus attention to drive the kinds of processes and resources and attention that is needed. We ended up, but we didn't have much time to elaborate, but I think it is an important issue about the tendency maybe to focus more on the branded good supply chains than unbranded for obvious reasons. If you're a company that an issue comes out and it has your name on it, your brand, then there's a greater risk to the company than if it's some of the unbranded goods. Of course, the guiding principles being very clear that when we're talking about managing human rights risks, it's about risks to human rights, to people, and not primarily the focus around what is the risk to the company. But that's, I think, was quite an interesting, I mean, the tendency, of course, naturally is to sort of go towards the supply chains where things can blow up maybe in a more direct sense, but it's, we ran out of time. So thank you.
I think probably that is one part of the summary of the session. We ran out of time because there is so much to discuss on this topic, and we are in early days, as Lene also indicated there. David, there was also interesting discussion in your group. Any specifics from your group? Any sectorial insights in how to deal with that?
Thank you. I didn't actually get to the point of sectoral insight, certainly on the maritime, because actually, to use somebody else's words, it was a very rich team that we had over there. Thank you very much indeed for all of your inputs. We followed the format, but we also had a lot of interaction. And the key points I want to pick out. Before I do that, I always say that bad things happen when good people turn away, and that's either a positive action or it's through ignorance. So with that as a background, and we're talking about Modern Slavery Act and we're talking about matters in the supply chain, we spoke about contractual terms. I spoke about effective remedy. Now, in the commercial world, effective remedy comes through invariably breach of contract, through damages. And of course, when you get to that level, you've got real hard lever. But how many people have contractual terms within their respective contracts for provision of services where they say, we have a policy and will respect the UNGPs? In terms of tools and audit, are there contractual terms about the tools that you'll use in terms of mapping between you and your second, third tiers? And what about audits? Do you have confidence in your auditors? Who are your auditors as well? But we also spoke about mapping and a timescale issue from finding providers and then the timescale of that provision of those goods and services, and also keeping a handle on what's happening at the front end from the showroom all the way back in the case we had of stone to quarries in other countries. We also spoke about internal supply codes of conduct as well, and the issues of seasonal workforces, particularly when we're talking about industries such as the groceries industry. So one of the other things that we covered was brought up was the issue of engagement and knowing your supply chain. And we discussed the training and awareness of those people who are usually the first joiners of the company, but who are actually your first responders, either people who are at the front end and the buyers, and them having the correct training and awareness that something may be not right in that factory or within that supply chain, and then being able to feed that up the management chain. And therefore, I think one of the points we came to was making it personal to you. We also discussed, and I'll finish here, we discussed people within companies actually going to the front end, the workforce, continuing professional development, seeing where your garments come from, seeing where your items that you sell actually come from, and then reporting back in order to make it personal and bring it alive. Not just us sitting in, frankly, good suits in a nice hotel talking about it, but actually making it real within your respective organisation, and therefore highlighting the advocacy and raising the issue so it does become a permanent discussion point, a pertinent discussion point. Does anybody want to add anything onto that? No. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for those insights. I would like now to turn to you. We've got around 10 minutes, say, for Q&A or for comments or suggestions from the participants here. There's a lot of knowledge and experience here behind the table, so I would almost say feel free to ask everything as long as it is linked to this topic. So who can I give the floor? Any specific questions or comments or suggestions you want to make? Can you also introduce yourself short?
Hi, good morning. My name's Owen. I work for Nestlé at the headquarters of the company in Switzerland. My question's about civil society and how business can best work with NGOs and campaigning groups who may traditionally have been antagonists, if we can say that, in the past, but increasingly become collaborators, because there's a lot of risks out there which we may not be aware of, which NGOs may be investigating, may be able to uncover. And I think from our perspective, we're looking more and more to actually gain their insights and their knowledge in terms of material risks that may be coming down the line. Recently for us, that's included labour issues in Brazil, in the coffee industry, which previously wasn't something which was very much top of the agenda internally at our company. So I guess my question is, how can business best work with civil society in a collaborative and engaging way and sort of move beyond that slightly more tense relationship which may have existed in the past?
Okay, thank you for that question. Looks logical that it's David and Phil to maybe first step in on this question.
Well, as one of those potential antagonists, I'm sure my name is used in many maritime boardrooms and darts thrown at pictures of me to make people feel better. It's actually an issue I raised, fear of civil society. You're right, civil society can be either collaborative or antagonistic, and it depends how those organisations are run, first of all. In our charity, we run a very collaborative process, and the short answer to your question is, talk to us. It's like a good marriage. It's true. It's like a good marriage. You're not always going to agree, and there's another thing about mutual respect. There's a huge them and us. If you look at the experience that are within civil society, it's huge. So if we can get away from the mindset of, well, we're a corporate body and I'm a lawyer, and the problem is mostly with the lawyers, forgive me, and that should not be on record. But the issue is the lawyers actually saying, no, that's a lie, that will get us into trouble. We're not going to write anything down. Actually have a Chatham House conversation with us, and you'll find a lot of people actually want to work with you, because what we don't want to do is then have to be writing lots of reports to then take you to task, and actually it takes both of our eyes off the ball in many respects, is my view.
Phil, your perspective here?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say, but I think I'll just say a couple of things. The first thing to say is, civil society is a spectrum of organisations, as businesses are a spectrum. We run from the National Rifle Association of the United States, is a civil society organisation, not one I particularly am fond of, right through to organisations that are very close to many other types of organisations. So distinguish between the different civil society organisations and be prepared to have different relationships with different types. Bill, I think that issue that was been raised about try to seek mature political relations. And mature political relations basically mean you accept that sometimes you're going to be called out. And sometimes there's going to be dialogue. And that's just the reality of the way in which governments act, the way in which companies act. So don't expect civil society, once you've started talking to them, to just shut up about all the things that they feel and see going on in supply chains. As I think Nestlé's demonstrated through their work with Behind the Brands, with Oxfam and lots of other organisations, building that mature political relationship is about the best guarantee you've got of being able to ensure that what's coming down the tube you know about, and also that there are real opportunities to learn from and work with, but also educate civil society. Because let's not kid ourselves, a lot of civil society is very concerned about business but knows almost nothing about it. And so that's also, you have to be aware about the education work you've got to do on them as well. But insisting on respect, mutual respect, I think is a key issue. And therefore saying, you've got to at least share the information with us before you put it out, so we can tell you what's wrong and what's right. That kind of minimum body of respect is something that's worth insisting on with civil society, because many of them feel scared about even approaching you, to be honest. That's the reality. I don't, but...
I think it's an interesting question because everyone wants to come in on that one. So, Lene?
Yeah, just supporting everything that has already been said, but I just want to highlight the role of reporting again and the opportunities that's actually presented by the drive, by the expectations in regulation that companies report on what they are doing to identify an issue. You cannot have a meaningful report without having spoken to people whose right might be at risk. Through civil society organizations, through trade unions, through those who know what's going on. Because how could you know what your risk of what risks you are engaged with or involved with if you haven't spoken to people? So that's really an opportunity for you to say, well, we actually have to go out and speak to people, and then of course presenting good reporting. So good reporting, again, not to say we are perfect, but good reporting that reflect an honest attempt to try and identify the issue, and thereby building up credibility with the serious organizations in civil society that can then see you as a partner in trying to approach and address the problems, rather than sort of, oh, this is just going to be window dressing and just a glossy publication that's not really reflective of the reality.
Yeah.
Yes, I think this is something we actually discussed in our group. I think that civil society, NGOs, are often the missing link to remediation, to real remedy, because once an issue has been identified, what we call a non-conformance or critical non-conformance. Let's take, for example, a child labor in a factory. It's hard for an audit body. An audit body would be judge and party if he was requested to deal with the problem, because he would have to report again on solving the problem and audit again this factory to say, I solved the problem. So often we prefer, this is a perspective of audit bodies, we really appreciate and value the work on the ground of the NGOs and the civil society, because they know what they're talking about. They're often local. They have the trust of the communities. They understand the overall picture, not only the factory picture, but they know that there is a village around the factory. There's a river running where chemicals are being poured in. They have a global picture, and so I think they're really, in the future, they could really solve the capacity building discussion that is raising, the judge and party discussion that is raising, and we should definitely there's definitely something to do there.
May I just add 2 points? It's actually of commercial benefit to you because it increases your capacity, and it's a force multiplier. We actually do it the other way around with commerce by getting our messages out through commerce, because we hit 60, 70 supporting companies, and they then put our work out and then tier it through. And you can do the same by using the NGOs, by actually, if you've got a good message and if it gets through the NGO filter, it increases your capacity and your positive profile, because at the end of the day, it's all about reputation. It's all about your reputation.
So in summary here, I would say it's a great additional resource to be used wisely, but building relationship and building the trust. I think that's also what I heard in all of your 4 answers. That is really, really key. And I've got an example here regarding busy human rights and mega sporting events, which I think is a great example where exactly that is happening. It is happening with a very broad variety of stakeholders, business, sponsors, sporting bodies, NGOs, civil society, trade unions, but also victims that were last week in a room discussing all what needs to be addressed or at hand in a very collaborative sphere. So it can be done, but it also takes time, because this process has already taken now a year to get where we are now with that group. I would allow for one more question from the floor in the interest of time. A burning question, who really said, that's a topic I want to have addressed in the last 5 minutes?
There's no slide.
No, just a question to you. It's not to do with slide. Any questions? Otherwise, I've got a question for the panel, so no worries. I will just take my question here. Coming back, say, from where we started with this morning, the UK Modern Slavery Act, which is, it's an enabler, because that's what I heard also in a few of the panels, for companies to start working on and convince management that this is a relevant topic. So legislation is a driver for change here. Early stages, we see a lot of companies addressing the issues, trying to find out what are the key issues, where do I need to focus on, what is my findings, what are my next steps. But what are my next steps? That is also, like Lene said it's early days. What is, in your view now, that are the necessary next steps to be taken in order to really bring the UK Modern Slavery Act further to life, but make sure it has its impact in really reducing modern slavery at hand? So what is, if you had to name, every one of you had to name one thing, that is most crucial, to focus on, what would that be? David?
Increased prosecutions.
Increased prosecutions? And why?
When people see other people being prosecuted for abuses, they tend to take note, and they tend to get their houses in order, and they tend to look closer in their own supply chains, because it's a precedent. So when you look at cases from court, you look at the judgments, the smart CSR teams, smart legal teams will look at those judgments, and then they'll say, does this apply to us, or could it apply to us? I think it's effective remedy.
Okay, Lene.
Yeah, I would also focus, I think that is where there needs to be more thinking, more development around the remedy bit. I mean, prosecution is one element, but I think there's also opening up the notion of remedy to be a little bit broader than only prosecution. I think accountability can come in many different forms, through contracts. What are the levers one can pull to ensure accountability, not only for reporting and making meaningful reporting and quality reporting, but of course most directly, what are the kinds of mechanisms that can be employed to ensure that there's accountability for wrongdoing where it happens, because often it's not here. It can be here, but it might well be far away. What does that mean for companies based in the UK when the harm is being done and you're directly linked to the harm through your products and services? But it's so what are the mechanisms that can be employed? And I think that we're all challenged by that. There are really no easy, and the prosecution is very difficult in terms of the current legal, international and national law. So I think that there's a lot more thinking that needs to go into addressing that issue of remedy.
You also mentioned accountability. A very short question here. Accountability, does it also mean if you identified something wrongdoing, you've tried to correct it, but your supplier is not able in addressing it in the way you want it to be addressed, is then saying to the supplier, we will not do business with you, is that then your ultimate solution? Or does that not really help the victims?
I think that's very situation specific. I think, as I think many will remember after Rana Plaza, when initially brands were saying, okay, we can't do business in Bangladesh anymore, and all the victims and all the trade unions, civil society say, please stay, don't run away, because we really need you here. And I think the walking away from a business relationship that where there is absolutely no chance, and after repeated efforts to improve the situation, should obviously be an option on the table. But I think it needs to be an option on the table that is certainly not the first resort, and that where you would need to take into consideration if going down that route, what would be the impacts actually of the people who might be affected by that decision as well. So again, it's one of the can be a very big dilemma situation. I don't think one can say anything general. You should then, if you've tried and it doesn't work, then you must always walk away. I think that's it. The complexity of a particular situation may still expect or may still suggest that you should stay in the relationship, but being able, if challenged, to be able to say and demonstrate what you have done, and being transparent about the reasons for maintaining a relationship that have these kinds of issues attached to them.
Okay, thank you. Cornelia, what is your advice?
I think the next step would be a materiality study. What I mean by that is I think that for every positive mechanism that's going to be put in place in the coming years, so prosecution, more disclosure, more reporting, more remedy, there's going to be a negative counter mechanism that is going to come from the ground. Because there's a profit to having modern slavery. Somebody's profiting from that, or it wouldn't happen. So we need to make sure that the business people, the people who are actually running the company, the people who are actually buying the goods, who are putting the goods on ships, actually care about what we're talking about today, actually know about it, care about it. And if they have one area of focus that interests them a bit more, one type of risk, one product, one sector, one country that they're more keen to do something for, that the top management addresses that through a materiality study, so really interrogating external stakeholder, internal stakeholder, civil society, and asking so I'm a big company, I'm a small company, I'm the biggest company in this country or in this sector, what would you want us to do? What would you want us to focus on? How would you want us to prioritize? If we had to work with an NGO, who would it be? Just trying to get a bit of engagement also from the core of the company. Or frankly, I feel it's going to be a very long battle between good and evil, if we don't.
Okay, thank you for that. Phil.
I think the first thing to say, is we run a registry that now has about 750 compliance statements for the Modern Slavery Act. We've done a lot, some initial analysis of that, including, an analysis of the FTSE 100 companies, the 27 that have responded so far. Of those, really, there's a leadership group of about 3 that are out ahead in terms of not only complying, but also answering the 6 suggested questions of the Modern Slavery Act in a way which indicates that they've really understood where slavery is in their supply chain and they've got action plans to do something about it. So the first thing that needs to happen is the long tail of companies that are at the moment have not got this in any way sorted, need to move up that performance chart. But I think there's a wider issue I'd just mention as well, which is that there is now, the Modern Slavery Act represents one part of a significant trend towards more mandatory compliance and transparency and more mandatory due diligence. And I think what we're seeing in terms of the Modern Slavery Act is that attempt at mandatory transparency, and what we're seeing in the United States with Obama's efforts at the Trade Facilitation Trade Enforcement Act and the disclosure requirements is again efforts at mandatory due diligence on the issue of modern slavery, focused on this most egregious issue of abusive exploitation in supply chains. We also have the Dutch government and the German government with their own textiles initiatives, again with significant focus on this area. So my sense of what needs, one of the things that I'd like to see happen next is that internationalization of those processes, so that particularly Europe and North America, particularly if Clinton gets in, following on from Obama, if the elections aren't rigged, as Trump says, Hillary Clinton will be looking at these issues and seeing ways. Equally, Trudeau in Canada will be doing the same. So there's an opportunity to get a single reporting requirement rather than a spaghetti soup of reporting requirements that inevitably, if every government in Europe and every government in North America has a different set of reporting requirements for transparency and requirements for due diligence, then there will be a reasonable reaction from business. The opportunity is to bring those together into a single reporting and due diligence requirement.
I can only support the last words from Phil here. Representing business. Although I like eating soup, we don't really, are looking forward to many more regulations there. So we need to find a way to streamline that. I think it was what we have seen here this morning. It's the tip of the iceberg. I just want to say here there's a lot of good things happening as well. Let's not focusing on everything that we haven't achieved yet. Let's also focus on what we already have achieved, and let's be proud about that. And we see many businesses taking the lead and really moving forward, but it doesn't mean there's not enough, there's still not a lot that needs to be done. And there is many more business that needs to take this on board in order to really make sure that you really accept your responsibility as a business. And going forward, coming from consumers, coming from investors, coming from all your stakeholders, to stay in business for the long term. So I think that is what part of the discussion is here today. I thank the panel for all the inputs. I thank you for being with us and contributing to, I would say, very lively debate also in the round tables. I would like to compliment those companies, where Phil also referred to, that have really done well in preparing the statements, and I really encourage you to look into that report. It's all available on the website. I think also both of the Anti-Slavery Commission, I think it's on there, but it's also on your website there. There's a lot of material out there. Don't invent the wheel. Look into what's already available, and I think most importantly, work together with your suppliers, within your supply chain, with your colleagues, with your competitors, with civil society and NGOs, because that's the only way we can drive this forward. So thank you, and enjoy coffee. And applause for the panel members.